Now that we've gone through several iterations of applying the scientific method in real-world scenarios, it's time to pause and look at a larger picture, if you will. We're going to spend some time watching a PBS Nova documentary called Judgment Day. And I have a few things that I want to say first before you watch it, because I think there's a lot to be had in this little documentary. I'll start with this idea. Who may serve on board a municipal school board? And the answer is pretty much anyone who is a citizen or a resident of the town. There aren't any qualifications per se. Now, I will say that in most cases, the people who do serve on these school boards are civic-minded, dedicated folks who want to go a little bit beyond simply showing up at the polls once or twice a year, and they want to get in there and actually make a difference in their communities, and they're there to be commended for that. Now, what does a school board do? Well, that is going to depend on where the school board is and what state it's in. Here in Maine, school boards are largely entities that deal with budget concerns, hiring and firing of teachers and superintendents, and the like. What they don't do, what is not in their charter, is to get their fingers into curriculum. They don't do that. That is not their province here in the state of Maine. In other states, however, they may. Pennsylvania is one such state in which school committees are, or school boards are allowed to actually get into school curriculum. So back to this idea of who may serve. Let me paint a ridiculous picture. Let's say that we're up in East Cherryfield, Maine, and East Cherryfield, Maine, they got, like any small town, you got the town drunk. And so Ethan Shumway is a town drunk up there in Cherryfield, Maine. And everybody likes Ethan, he's a good fella. He made it all the way up to the 8th grade, and that's as far as he went. So one night he's down there at the American Legion sucking down $2 PBRs, and a bunch of his buddies decide they're going to have a little fun with Ethan. They wait till he's got a few beers into him, and they come up and say, "Ethan, you ever thought about running for school board?" "No," says Ethan. "Well, we think you ought to. You're the right guy for that job." "You really think so?" says Ethan. "Yup." And so they have a big chuckle over that, and nobody thinks more about it. But what they weren't planning on is the next morning, Ethan Shumway's down there at the town hall pulling out nomination papers. That next night, he's back at the Legion with his nomination papers, and they say, "Oh boy, this is a good one." And everybody signs his nomination papers. The next thing you know, Ethan Shumway's on the ballot for school board, and nobody else is running. So guess what? Ethan Shumway, town drunk, 8th grade education, is on the school board. Now, you might think that that's completely ridiculous, but let me tell you, I live in a very, very small town, and I have seen some weird stuff in my small town. Now, in Pennsylvania, some years ago, a new batch of folks were elected to the school board. Now, again, it's important to understand that even though in some states, people in their respective school boards and school committees are allowed to work, to get involved in curriculum, they are not, by definition, subject matter experts. They are not experts in curriculum. They're not supposed to be experts in curriculum. That's not their job. Nevertheless, there are places where they are allowed to get into areas that are outside their expertise. This happened in a little town of Dover, Pennsylvania, some years ago. This freshly elected batch of folks in the school board decided that they were going to get into the biology curriculum of the public schools, specifically with a view toward including something called intelligent design as in their words, an alternative theory to the theory of evolution. there's no nice way to say this, so I'm not going to try. A shitstorm ensued. There were lawsuits and people got hurt. It tore this town apart. And that's what this documentary is about. Now, first of all, let me tell you that intelligent design is not in any way, shape, or form a scientific theory. It just ain't. It does not meet the criteria of a scientific theory. Truth be told, intelligent design is a variant on creationism, plain and simple, dressed up in scientific lingo. And I know that it may upset a few folks, but there it is. And I also want to point out, before I go any further, that what we are about to watch and what I'm trying to get across is not whether evolution is right or wrong, or whether creationism is right or wrong. What needs to be understood is what is science and what is not science. And this case in Dover, Pennsylvania, went to trial on that very idea. In order for this to pass muster, they had to make the case that intelligent design was in fact a valid scientific theory. And in order to do that, they had to also establish in the court proceedings, well, what is science? As you watch this documentary, I want you to pay particular attention to the language, its use and its misuse. Now, we've already talked a little bit about this idea of a critique of science, and in particular evolution, being just a theory. We hear that over and over again. By now, you should have a clear view of what a scientific theory truly is. Another critique that we hear oftentimes, and we hear it, and especially now in these days of the pandemic, we hear often as a critique of science that there are gaps in a scientific theory. Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, there ain't no such thing as a scientific theory what don't got gaps in it. That is what makes a scientific theory a theory. Gaps are not flaws in a scientific theory. Gaps are the fuel that drive science. They are the red flags that tell scientists, over here, this is where you are supposed to be looking. And I offer up as an example the periodic table of the elements. Now, you guys suffered with this one in high school, I know. The periodic table of the elements is a recent invention. It's not even 200 years old. Once we begin to understand how atoms are put together, then we were able to develop this. The periodic table is arranged according to how atoms are built. So here we have carbon. See that number 6 there? That means that a carbon atom has 6 protons in its nucleus. Nitrogen, 7 protons in the nucleus. Oxygen, 8 protons in the nucleus, and so on and so on. And once we begin to understand that there is an actual order, that there's an order to how atoms are built, how they work, then we begin to really get into what we now call chemistry, how substances do what they do. As this periodic table of the elements, dare I say it, evolved, it became apparent that there were gaps where there should be an element, but nothing has been discovered. As an example, germanium. Germanium was, nobody knew of its existence 150 years ago. But here we go, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, germanium. There should be that periodic table of the elements which had a gap, and it told scientists that there ought to be an element out there with 32 protons in its nucleus. Then they began to look for it, and they found it. Germanium is, by the way, is a semiconductor, is one of the important elements used in the first transistors when they were built in the 1950s. But that's just one example. It's the gaps in a scientific theory that drive science. Science is about discovering what we don't know, and the gaps tell us what we don't know. They are not flaws in science. They are the strength of science. The gaps are what make science do what it do. So, for the most part, this documentary speaks for itself. But again, I want you to pay particular attention to the language, its use and its misuse, and you will see certain examples of how the scientific method works in terms of predictions, in terms of quantifiable techniques. And then, somewhere around the 1 hour 30-minute mark, you'll see a testimony by a Dr. Behe, who in trial is asked to define how science works. And I want you to pay attention to that. He will not talk about the scientific method that we've been talking about. Remember, the scientific method, that's courtesy of Galileo. No, instead, he talks about science in terms of what Aristotle had to say. He considers a scientific theory in terms of the Pythagorean Aristotelian model, which is really quite telling. So watch for that one too. I don't expect you to sit and watch this whole thing in one sitting for 2 hours. Your eyes will glaze over. Don't do that. So watch it for about 20 minutes, half an hour or so. Hit pause, go get yourself a sandwich, come back, watch it. Maybe even rewind a little bit, but watch it and get through it. But this too is part of the curriculum. I want you to see how this works. And again, the important takeaway, there are several important takeaways, but the big important takeaway is how, in a court of law, we wound up having to define what science is and what science isn't. And I can't think of a more important time in recent years where that is more important. So, enjoy.